I still remember every page of the curriculum I wrote for my ninth graders back in 1987. I can recite the school's phone number from 30 years ago, and I know exactly where I filed my tax returns every April since 1973. But according to my daughter, I am no longer capable of managing my own life. Let me tell you what happened. My name is not important. What is important is that I taught high school English for 31 years in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. I retired at 63, healthy, sharp, and with enough saved to live comfortably without asking anyone for a single thing. I raised 2 children in that house on Birchwood Drive. I painted the shutters myself the summer my husband passed. I planted the rose bushes along the front walk, and I have kept them alive every winter since. My daughter, I will call her Renee, is 41 years old. She married a man named Derek about 8 years ago. Derek has a way of smiling while he talks that always made me feel like I was being evaluated rather than spoken to. Renee was never like that before she met him. She used to call me every Sunday. She used to drive up from Cincinnati just to sit at my kitchen table and drink coffee and talk about nothing in particular. I miss that version of her more than she will ever know. My son Paul lives in Portland. We talk once a week. He sends me books he thinks I would like, and sometimes I read them, and sometimes I do not. But I always tell him what I thought, because he deserves that. Paul never asked me for anything beyond conversation. I want you to keep that in mind as this story moves forward. It started, as these things often do, with something small. About 3 years ago, Renee called on a Tuesday afternoon, not our usual day, and asked if I had thought about getting my finances organized. I told her they were organized. She said she meant professionally organized, with someone qualified to manage them. I told her I had a financial advisor I had worked with for 11 years, and I trusted him completely. She said that was fine. She just wanted to make sure I was protected. I thanked her and moved on. Then Derek called. That was the first time he had ever called me directly, without Renee on the line. He said he had a friend who was a financial planner, someone who worked specifically with retirees, and that this person could look over my accounts and make sure everything was set up correctly for the future. I told him I was already set up correctly, but I appreciated him thinking of me. He said, of course. He said they just wanted to help. I should have recognized that word then. Help. It is the most dangerous word in the English language when it comes from the wrong mouth. Over the following months, the calls became more frequent. Renee began asking me questions she had never asked before. Whether I had a power of attorney drawn up, whether my will was current, whether I had considered what would happen to the house if something happened to me suddenly. I answered each question carefully and calmly, because I am a patient woman and because she was my daughter, and I wanted to believe she was asking out of love. I had a will. I had written it 12 years ago with an attorney named Robert Gallagher, who has an office on the second floor of a brick building on Elm Street, downtown. Everything was straightforward. The house and my savings were to be divided equally between Renee and Paul. That was what I wanted. That was what I had decided when my husband and I sat across from Robert together and talked it through, and I had never had reason to change it. But that fall, something shifted. Renee called and told me she had been doing research, and she was worried about my cognitive health. I asked her why. She said I had repeated myself on the phone a few weeks earlier, and that I sometimes forgot details from previous conversations. I sat very still in my kitchen chair when she said that. I thought about the 31 years I had spent standing in front of classrooms, adjusting my explanations on the fly, reading a room of teenagers and knowing exactly which student needed encouragement and which one needed to be challenged. I thought about the lesson plans I still kept in binders on my shelf, organized by year, every one of them annotated in my own handwriting. I asked her which conversation she was referring to. She could not name one specifically. She said it was just a pattern she had noticed. I told her I was fine. She said she hoped so. 2 weeks later, she called again and mentioned that Derek had found a doctor, a geriatric specialist, who did cognitive evaluations, and that it might give everyone peace of mind if I just went in for an appointment. I told her I had a doctor I was perfectly happy with, and that if there were any concerns about my health, I would discuss them with him. She said she was only trying to help. There was that word again. I did not go to the specialist. Instead, I made an appointment with my own doctor, a man I have trusted for over 20 years, and I asked him directly whether there was any reason to be concerned about my cognitive function. He ran the standard assessments, asked me the questions they ask, and at the end, he looked at me over the rims of his glasses and said that I was as sharp as anyone half my age, and that I should not let anyone convince me otherwise. I kept a copy of his written notes. I want to pause here and tell you about my neighbor, a woman named Harriet, who is 74 and has lived across the street from me since before my children were in middle school. Harriet is the kind of person who notices when your porch light has been out for 2 days and leaves a new bulb in a paper bag by your door without saying a word. She brought me soup the week after my husband's funeral and sat with me for 3 hours without once checking her phone. She is not the kind of person who asks, "What is in your will?" She has never once asked me anything about my finances. Harriet became important later. Keep that in mind. In January of that year, I received a letter in the mail. It was from an attorney I had never heard of, with an address in Cincinnati. The letter stated that it had come to the attorney's attention that I might benefit from a guardianship review, and that Renee, acting as a concerned family member, had initiated a preliminary inquiry. The letter explained that a guardianship proceeding would involve a court evaluating whether I was capable of managing my own personal and financial affairs. I read that letter 3 times at my kitchen table. Then I set it down and looked out the window at the rose bushes, still gray and bare in January, and I breathed. I was not confused. I was not panicked. I was something quieter than that, and something colder. I was absolutely certain of what was happening, and absolutely certain of what I was going to do about it. I called Robert Gallagher that same afternoon. I had not spoken to him in almost 4 years, but he remembered me immediately and told me to come in the next morning. I brought the letter. I brought the notes from my doctor. I brought 2 years of bank statements, organized in a folder by month. I brought my tax returns. I brought the documentation from my financial advisor showing every account, every transaction, every decision I had made over the past decade, and the reasoning behind each one. Robert looked at everything for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said that what my daughter had filed was a preliminary petition, and that it had not yet been formally submitted to the court. He said I had time to respond, and that my response needed to be clear, documented, and unambiguous. He said the best thing I could do was make sure that every legal document connected to my name was updated, airtight, and entirely in my own hands. We spent 4 hours in that office. By the time I left, I had updated my will. I had established a revocable living trust, with Robert as the trustee and Paul named as the successor trustee. I had assigned my durable power of attorney specifically to Paul, with language that required two independent physicians to certify any incapacity before it could be activated. Not one, not a family member's recommendation, but two independent licensed physicians. I had added a no contest clause to my will, which meant that anyone who challenged the document in court would automatically be removed from it entirely. And I had changed the beneficiary designations on every account. Renee's share was still there. I want to be clear about that. I did not act out of spite. I acted out of precision, but the structure was now such that no one, not Renee, not Derek, not any attorney in Cincinnati, could touch a single dollar or a single square foot of that house without going through a legal process that I had built myself with my own hands on my own terms. Robert asked me if I wanted to notify Renee that I had updated my documents. I thought about it for a moment. I said no. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The rose bushes were still bare. I had planted those the spring after my husband died because I needed something to take care of, something that required patience, and came back every year, whether or not the winter had been kind. I thought about that for a while. Then I went inside and made dinner. In February, I received a call from an attorney's office asking me to confirm certain personal details, which I declined to do. I consulted Robert, who sent a formal letter on my behalf stating that I was legally represented and that any further contact regarding a guardianship petition should be directed to his office. The calls stopped. In March, Renee called me directly. She did not mention the petition. She talked about the weather and a trip she and Derek were planning to Savannah. I listened. I was polite. I did not bring it up either. But I recorded the call because Ohio is a one-party consent state. And Robert had advised me that documentation of normal, coherent conversation could be useful. I was calm. I was present. I mentioned the book Paul had sent me, a novel set in coastal Maine, and I summarized the plot accurately and offered a specific opinion about the author's handling of the ending. I talked about Harriet's dog, who had recently learned to open the gate latch. I talked about the rose bushes, which were showing the first green tips of the season. I sounded exactly like myself, because I was exactly myself. The formal petition was never filed. I do not know exactly when Renee and Derek spoke with their attorney after Robert's letter went out, and I do not know what was said in that conversation. What I know is that nothing was filed, and nothing has been filed since. I want to tell you about something Harriet said to me that spring, when we were standing at the edge of my driveway, watching her dog investigate the rose bushes with great seriousness. I had told her a small amount of what had happened. Not everything, but enough. Harriet is not a woman who responds to hard news with noise. She was quiet for a moment, watching the dog, and then she said something I have not forgotten. She said, "The people who decide you are helpless are usually the ones who need you to be." I have thought about that sentence many times since. My relationship with Renee is not what it was. I do not know if it will ever be what it was. There are Sunday afternoons now when I sit at my kitchen table with my coffee, and the silence feels different than it used to, heavier in certain spots. I am 68 years old, and I understand that some losses do not come with a clear date. They accumulate quietly, like sediment, until one day you notice the water is different, and you cannot say exactly when it changed. But I am also honest enough to say this: I am not broken by it. I was not broken by it. Paul came to visit in April. He did not know the full story until he arrived, and I watched his face while I told him, sitting at that same kitchen table. And I saw something move across his expression that I recognized from when he was 12 years old and found out that something unfair had happened to someone he loved. He started to say something sharp about Renee, and I held up my hand because I did not need his anger on my behalf. I needed him to understand the situation clearly, which is different. I told him that I had handled it. I showed him the documents. I explained the structure of the trust and the power of attorney and what it would take to activate any of it. His name was there because I trusted him, not because of what was happening with his sister. He needed to understand that. He stayed for 5 days. We cooked together every evening. He finished the novel about coastal Maine that I had started, and we argued in a good-natured way about the ending, and it was one of the better weeks I have had in recent memory. In May, I went back to Robert's office for a follow-up review of everything. He said the documents were solid. He said I had done it right. I asked him if he saw situations like mine often. He was quiet for a moment before answering. Then he said more often than people realized, and that the saddest cases were the ones where the older person never found out until it was too late. I asked him what made the difference. He said the difference was almost always whether the person trusted their own mind. He said people could be convinced to doubt themselves with surprisingly little pressure, especially when the pressure came from family. He said the ones who held on, who documented, who called attorneys, who refused to let anyone else define their capacity for them. Those were the ones who kept their lives intact. I drove home along the same roads I have driven for 40 years, past the school where I taught, which has a new wing now that I barely recognize, past the grocery store where I still run into former students sometimes, grown adults with children of their own who stop in the produce section and say, "Mrs." and then my name, with a kind of warmth that still surprises me. Past the brick building on Elm Street, where Robert's office is on the 2nd floor. When I got home, Harriet was watering her front garden. She waved. The dog was investigating something near the gate with the same focused seriousness as always. I stood at the edge of my driveway for a moment before going inside. The rose bushes were in full bloom, pink along the left side, deep red along the right, exactly where I planted them. They came back this year, the same as every year, without anyone's help, without anyone's permission. I went inside. I put the kettle on. I took out my notebook. I still keep one, a habit from 31 years of lesson planning. And I wrote down a few things I wanted to remember. Not about Renee, not about the petition, not about Derek or the attorney in Cincinnati. I wrote down what Harriet had said. I wrote down what Robert had said about people who trust their own minds. And then I wrote, in my own handwriting, in the same cursive I learned in 2nd grade and have never stopped using. I know exactly who I am. I have always known, and no one, not ever, will sign that away from me. I closed the notebook and put it in the top drawer of my desk, next to my will, my trust documents, my power of attorney, my doctor's notes, and the letter from the attorney in Cincinnati that started all of this. Let them stay together. That is where they belong.